The night sky over the Philippines was red and black, a pulse of thunder rolling over the sea. It was 1944, and an American patrol boat drifted close to the shoreline, engines humming low. The crew thought the flashes on the horizon were lightning, until the ocean itself began to burn. The first bomb hit the water 30 yards away. It didn't sink. It burst open, scattering a thick, shimmering liquid that floated instead of sinking. Then, impossibly, it ignited. Flames crawled across the waves. The fire clung to the surface, crawling like a living thing. The sailors shouted, pointing into the darkness, "It's burning on the damn water!" Every instinct in them said this couldn't happen. Fire dies in water. That's how nature works. But nature had just been rewritten. The liquid didn't drift apart. It thickened, bubbled, and spread faster with every wave that touched it. The air filled with a sweet chemical stench. The color wasn't the red of gasoline. It was deeper, alive, feeding on something invisible. A sailor fired a machine gun at the blaze in panic, bullets vanishing into the glow. The ocean was no longer safe. Above, the plane that had dropped the canisters turned toward the clouds, leaving behind a trail of smoke and disbelief. The weapon had no name yet. To the men who witnessed it, it felt like witchcraft disguised as science. By morning, word spread across the fleet. The Americans had built a new kind of fire, one that refused to die, one that burned on water, one that followed the rules of chemistry written by a man everyone in Washington now called the Mad Chemist. His name was Louis Fieser. His creation would change the face of war and the moral temperature of humanity itself. For centuries, humans believed one simple truth, that water defeats fire. It was the first law every civilization learned, the boundary between safety and destruction. Pour water on flames and they die. That's how the world was supposed to work. But war, as it always does, had other plans. When Allied troops in the Pacific first heard rumors of a new fuel that could burn across ponds, rivers, even the ocean, they dismissed it as madness. "No chemical can outfight the sea," one Navy engineer said. "Physics doesn't negotiate." Yet in late 1942, behind the quiet red brick walls of Harvard University, a team of chemists was doing exactly that. The project was buried under the code name Harvard Group 13. Funded by the Office of Scientific Research and Development, its mission wasn't to make fire. It was to make fire controllable. To build an incendiary that could stick, last, and spread anywhere. Gasoline burned too fast. Phosphorus was unstable. What the Army needed was something that combined both, a weapon that could be stored, shipped, and unleashed like a liquid storm. The man chosen to create it was Dr. Louis Fieser, brilliant, impatient, and utterly fearless with chemistry. He'd already built synthetic vitamin K, explosives, and smoke bombs. But what he wanted now was something bigger. He wanted to bend fire itself. When he first heard the military's requirements, a fuel that could cling to wet surfaces and resist water, he didn't laugh. He simply said, "Then we make water part of the fire." That sentence terrified his colleagues. To many, Fieser's experiments bordered on obsession. He mixed soap-like compounds into gasoline, melted aluminum powders into the blend, stirred it by hand. Every test ended in chaos. Splashes, burns, explosions. And every time he smiled, scribbling in his notebook. Viscosity increasing, adhesion promising. To the outside world, it looked like insanity. But he was chasing something precise. A chemical reaction that could trap oxygen inside its own body, allowing flame to live where it shouldn't. The myth that water kills fire would die quietly in a Harvard basement in 1942, drowned not by reason, but by invention. And when the first test succeeded, Fieser didn't cheer. He just said, "Now let's see if the world can handle it." By 1942, the Second World War had turned into a contest of laboratories as much as armies. The Allies needed more than courage. They needed chemistry, physics, and mathematics to outthink the enemy's machines. Behind the front lines, professors became weapons manufacturers, and classrooms turned into assembly lines for destruction. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University was no longer a school. It was a battlefield of formulas. The U.S. government's Office of Scientific Research and Development had quietly transformed its chemistry department into a weapons lab. The name on the door was harmless, Research Group 13. Inside, men in white coats mixed death. Louis Fieser ran the group like a general. He was short-tempered, brilliant, and utterly devoted to efficiency. His lectures had once been about organic compounds. Now they were about flammability. The goal, he told his team, isn't to make explosions, it's to make persistence, fire that doesn't let go. He already had a reputation for boldness. Before the war, he'd synthesized new forms of rubber and dyes. He worked with bare hands, smoking cigars over open beakers. His students called him fearless, or mad, depending on the day. When the Army Chemical Corps approached him with a request for a new incendiary, they wanted something stronger than gasoline, but cheaper than phosphorus. They needed a weapon that could destroy jungle cover, fuel depots, and wooden cities, anywhere, anytime. Fieser listened, then asked one question. Does it need to go out? The officer hesitated. Preferably not. That was enough. The first experiments were crude. Gasoline mixed with aluminum naphthenate, thickened by soap. Most attempts failed. The fuel burned unevenly, separated into puddles, or exploded outright. The smell of scorched paint and melted glass filled the lab. Still, Fieser refused to stop. He understood something fundamental. Liquid fire was a paradox that could only exist through chemistry's smallest laws. If he could alter surface tension, make the molecules grip instead of run, he could teach fire to cling. Weeks turned into months. Harvard's campus echoed with the sound of explosions muffled by snow. Students complained about the smell drifting through lecture halls. The dean pretended not to notice. War excused everything. Then, in early 1943, Fieser walked into his lab holding a beaker filled with a reddish gel. Sticky, slow-moving, dense. He poured a drop onto a concrete floor and struck a match. The flame hissed, then erupted, crawling instead of flickering. He smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've made something that shouldn't exist." In that moment, the line between science and sorcery disappeared. The world's most civilized university had just given birth to the most uncivilized weapon of the war. Every invention can be measured, even the ones that terrify their makers. In the notebooks of Louis Fieser, the birth of a new kind of fire was recorded not in words of awe, but in the cold language of chemistry: ratios, temperature points, viscosity. The data read like prophecy. Regular gasoline burned at roughly 500 degrees Celsius and lasted no more than 20 seconds on open ground. Too thin, too volatile. It flashed, then died. Soldiers called it fast fire. Fieser's new mixture was slower, heavier. A sticky gel made from aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids blended into aviation gasoline. The name came from those very ingredients: anaphthe and palmitate. Napalm. Napalm burned between 800 and 200 degrees Celsius. Once ignited, it could sustain combustion for up to 7 minutes. It didn't spread. It crawled. Each drop clung to surfaces like liquid tar. Instead of vaporizing on water, it trapped microscopic air bubbles inside its gelatin matrix. That oxygen fed the reaction even when submerged. It was, chemically speaking, impossible. A flame that didn't need air to start or water to stop. When tested against gasoline, the difference wasn't just visible, it was physical. Napalm burned with a deeper orange hue, hotter and denser. The heat it released per gallon was 12 times greater than standard fuel. And then came the industrial numbers. A single gallon cost 65 cents to produce, cheaper than milk in wartime America. Factories could make 1 million gallons a week with existing infrastructure. It could be stored safely, transported easily, and ignited by the simplest spark. For the Army, it was perfect. For the chemists, it was unstoppable. During field demonstrations, military observers watched in silence as Fieser's mixture burned on puddles of water and even wet sand. The colonel in charge wrote in his report, "We can't put it out." That phrase, "we can't put it out," became both a triumph and a curse. Napalm was light enough for aircraft canisters, thick enough for flamethrowers, and stable enough to ship by rail. It solved every problem the military had, and created one humanity had never faced before. It was the first time in history that a human being had engineered an element of nature not to consume fuel, but to consume everything. The math of ignition had been rewritten, and from that moment, fire would never obey water again. The first real test of Louis Fieser's new fuel didn't happen in a military lab. It happened beside a pond in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a quiet, tree-lined patch of Harvard's campus where professors once fed ducks and talked about philosophy. By the spring of 1943, Fieser's team had refined the formula enough to risk an open demonstration. Soldiers from the Army Chemical Corps arrived with clipboards, standing back from the water's edge. The chemists rolled out metal drums of the new gel, each labeled napalm, experimental lot number 2. Fieser stood with his sleeves rolled up, a matchbox in his hand. And "If this works," he said calmly, "you'll never forget what it looks like." He tipped a bucket into the pond. The liquid spread slowly, shimmering across the surface like oil. Then he struck the match. The flame didn't flicker. It exploded. A roar filled the air. The water itself seemed to catch fire, rippling with waves of bright orange. Flames crawled across the pond, following the surface tension like veins of molten glass. The Army observers stumbled backward, shouting. One dropped his clipboard into the dirt. But Fieser didn't flinch. He watched the fire spread in a perfect circle, recording the radius, the time, the temperature. 9 meters per minute, he murmured. Still burning on contact. When the flames reached the edge of the pond, they clung to the reeds, igniting the bank. Students watching from the chemistry building screamed. Within seconds, the calm Harvard pond had become a ring of fire that refused to go out. Someone yelled, "It's still burning!" A soldier tried to smother a patch with sand. It didn't work. Another poured water from a canteen. The flames flared brighter, not weaker. Only when the gel ran out of oxygen did it collapse into smoking tar. Silence followed, long, heavy, and frightened. The pond was gone, replaced by a sheet of blackened residue still bubbling from the heat. Fieser removed his goggles and said softly, "Reaction confirmed." That night he wrote his report. Fuel behaves independently of water interference. Combustion self-sustaining. Adhesion to organic matter exceeds expectations. The next morning the phone rang. It was the Army. "You've built something we can't put out," the voice said. "How soon can we make more?" From that day, Harvard's chemistry building stopped being a campus landmark. It became the birthplace of a weapon that ignored nature. And in the eyes of the military, Louis Fieser had done something greater than invention. He had manufactured control. The fire he created no longer belonged to the world of physics. It belonged to war. The experiment at the pond should have ended as a scientific curiosity, a terrifying proof of concept, then forgotten. Instead, it triggered an industrial chain reaction. Within 6 months, napalm had left the laboratory and entered mass production. The U.S. War Department didn't hesitate. Contracts went out to Standard Oil, DuPont, and General Electric. Each factory was ordered to convert part of its capacity to incendiary gel compound at a scale the world had never seen. By the end of 1943, America was producing 1.5 million gallons of napalm every week. The logistics were staggering. Rail cars filled with drums of the thick reddish fuel rolled out of refineries in New Jersey, Ohio, and Louisiana. From there, the mixture was pumped into flamethrowers, firebombs, and portable tanks for the Pacific Campaign. What began as chemistry became industry, and what industry produces, war consumes. The math of destruction was simple. A single 165-gallon canister could ignite an area the size of a football field. One B-29 bomber could carry 37 of them. A full air raid could lay down a sea of fire 10 square miles wide. Soldiers were trained to use napalm as a tool, not a terror. Clear jungle cover, eliminate bunkers, burn fuel depots. The manuals used clean words. The reality was chaos made efficient. In tropical climates, rain couldn't kill it. In the Pacific's humidity, the gel burned even hotter. The water vapor actually helped it spread. Engineers tweaked the formula for climate, density, and altitude. Each adjustment made the fuel more obedient to command, less forgiving to the enemy. By 1944, fire had become a military instrument, not a byproduct. The line between weapon and element was gone. In the reports sent to Washington, the phrasing was clinical. Field results exceed expectations, adherence stable, suppression minimal. In truth, the tests had revealed something deeper, that war had discovered its perfect servant. Fire no longer cared about weather, distance, or mercy. It only cared about fuel. Louis Fieser had built the most efficient incendiary ever made, and he couldn't unmake it. Iwo Jima, February 1945. The island smelled of sulfur and salt, and 1,000 burned things. Marines moved like shadows between blackened ridges, listening for the cough of rifles and the whisper of tunnels. The Japanese defenders had learned to live under the ground, networks of caves and bunkers carved into volcanic rock, connected by narrow passages and trapdoors. Bullets could kill a man. They could not find him in the dark. Enter the flamethrower team. 2 men, a fuel tank, a lance, and a short list of orders. Behind them marched engineers and demolition squads. When the lance coughed, it did not spit a quick flame. It poured a thick, blistering river that clung to rock and flesh alike. The napalm mixture stuck to the mouths of tunnels, sealing them, frying the oxygen out of cavities, turning hidden positions into ovens. On Hill 382, the effect was immediate. A squad of Marines trained their flamethrowers at a bunker entrance and watched the doorway melt into orange. Men who had been sniping from inside never came back out. The blast wave carried the heat through passages. The fire chased the defenders into corners where air itself became enemy. For the assaulting infantry, napalm did something simple and terrifying. It made the concealed visible, and the invisible survivable no more. Marine officers later described the sound as a living thing, an animal breathing, then gagging, then dying. Napalm didn't just burn, it announced itself. The flame revealed tunnel systems by the way smoke and heat spilled from vents and fissures. Engineers followed the heat, collapsed roofs and cleared chambers with grenades and wire cutters. Commanders who had once relied on coordinated artillery lift and infantry probes now found a blunt new tool. Napalm allowed assaults on fixed, fortified positions without the days-long preparatory bombardments that gave defenders time to move supplies or civilians. It shortened sieges and reduced exposure for assault troops, at the cost of turning landscapes into scorched maps. On one night at Iwo Jima, a single napalm-assisted push tore a defensive line that had resisted conventional bombardment for weeks. The operation claimed dozens of Japanese strongpoints in hours. Marines wrote in letters home that the flame ate the island, that entire ridgelines glowed like forges. They acknowledged, too, the hush that followed. No song, as only the heavy breathing of men who had seen what the fuel did to living things. Napalm changed tactical calculus. A bunker that required a platoon and a day to clear before could be neutralized by a single flamethrower team supported by a squad of infantry within an hour. The tempo of attack sped up. The cost in time and exposed manpower fell. In tactical after-action reports, commanders marked efficiency in crisp statistics, reduced casualties, faster objective times. But those numbers hid human detail, the burned roofs and the way smoke clung to newly cut victory. For the men on the ground, napalm was a tool that saved comrades and took enemies in a way nothing else could. For those who studied the battle maps later, it was a moment when chemistry overruled geography. Fire that once obeyed rivers and rain now obeyed orders. And battlefield geometry was rewritten accordingly. Tokyo, March 9, 1945. Midnight. The sky trembled with the steady drone of engines. 334 B-29 bombers climbing through darkness toward the most crowded city on Earth. Below them stretched 20 square miles of wooden homes, paper walls, and narrow alleys. The perfect fuel for a weapon born in a Harvard pond. The plan was called Operation Meeting House. The weapon was napalm. At 12:08 a.m., the first bomber opened its bay doors and released dozens of canisters. They tumbled through cold air, small black shapes carrying thick orange death. When they hit, they didn't explode like conventional bombs. They burst open, splattering the streets with sticky fire that clung to roofs, walls, and skin. The first fires merged into a sheet. Then the sheet became a storm. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods disappeared into a vortex of heat so intense that asphalt ran like syrup and metal bent like wax. Wind born of fire howled through Tokyo's narrow streets, sucking in oxygen and feeding the flames until they formed their own weather. Witnesses later called it a fire tornado. Survivors said the air burned before the flames touched them. In 6 hours, 100,000 people died. 16 square miles of Tokyo vanished. The city became a glowing scar visible from 150 miles away. Pilots flying above could smell burned lacquer and wood through their oxygen masks. One crewman described looking down and seeing rivers of fire rolling through the city, twisting like molten veins. Napalm didn't just destroy buildings. It changed how war measured destruction. Explosives shattered targets. Fire erased them. What bombers once needed precision to hit, napalm erased with indifference. Every building became kindling, every gust of wind an accomplice. In Cambridge, Louis Fieser received the news days later. A colleague handed him a newspaper with the headline, "Tokyo Annihilated by Fire." He read the article silently, then folded it in half. "It worked," he said quietly, and walked out of the room. He never publicly claimed regret, only clarity. "I didn't invent war," he said years later. "I invented a chemical reaction. What people do with it is not chemistry." But even he knew the truth behind the numbers. Napalm had changed the moral weight of fire. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a force of annihilation that no conscience could extinguish. The B-29 crews called the Tokyo mission the most efficient air raid in history. Efficiency. That was the word the reports used, the same word used in Fieser's lab. The chemistry had remained perfect. Humanity had not. Louis Fieser never stood trial, never faced protest during the war, and never doubted the precision of his work. To him, napalm was chemistry, not morality. "A reaction doesn't choose its target," he once said. "It just follows the equation." History, however, rarely follows equations. By the time peace came in 1945, Fieser's formula had spread from Harvard to every continent. Factories in Europe, Asia, and America were producing variations of his mixture. In the Pacific, the U.S. called it liberation fire. In Korea and Vietnam, decades later, others would call it by a different name, hell. He lived long enough to see protesters carrying signs with his invention's name written in ash. When students asked if he regretted it, he told them, "It was a good weapon." He never apologized because in his mind, he had done his job correctly. Fire obeyed him. The world's reaction did not. Napalm burned at over 1,000 degrees, but its real heat lay in what it revealed about humanity. It proved that once science gives war a new tool, conscience arrives too late. The same intellect that cures diseases can ignite cities. The same discipline that discovers truth can erase it. In the post-war years, Fieser published textbooks, won awards, and never mentioned the word napalm again. But those who knew him said sometimes he paused in the middle of a lecture, staring at the flame of his lighter too long before closing it. He had built a fire that refused to die, even inside him. When he died in 1977, obituaries praised his brilliance and noted his controversial wartime contributions. None of them used the word mad, but the world still did. Because Louis Fieser had achieved what alchemists once dreamed of, a flame that defied water, a fuel that outlived morality. He proved that science could conquer nature, and that man could lose himself in the victory. Louis Fieser's fire never went out. It lived in jungles, in cities, in the memories of those who saw it crawl across water and flesh alike. He left behind no apology, only a formula, one that still sits in textbooks, stripped of its history, clean and neutral on the page. But every equation hides a shadow. Fieser had shown the world that invention doesn't ask for permission. It only asks if it works. In war, that's enough. The chemist who built fire that burned underwater never stood before any tribunal because his weapon won. Victory, as always, forgave the means. Yet long after the medals and the factories vanished, his flame kept teaching the same lesson, that brilliance without conscience burns longer than napalm ever could. April 16, 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, the Pacific was on fire. The destroyer USS Laffey rocked in the swells, its hull already torn open, its decks black with smoke. For 80 minutes, the sky had rained kamikazes. 22 planes had dived at her, and 6 had struck home. Flames crawled across the gun mounts, ammunition cooked off like popcorn, and the smell of burning oil turned the air into poison. Down below in the engine room, the sound was worse. The ship's heartbeat fading. Boiler pressure was spiking past safe limits. Steam hissed through ruptured pipes like screams. A petty officer shouted, "She's gonna blow!" Chief Petty Officer Harold Denton didn't move. His face was streaked with grease and soot. He looked at the gauges, then at the cracked coolant line spewing scalding mist. If that line failed completely, the boiler would detonate and take 300 men with it. "Get me metal," he said. A machinist's mate blinked. "Sir, we're out of fittings." Denton pointed to the corner of the compartment where a wrecked cargo tractor sat half-crushed under debris. It had been used for deck loading before the attack, a forgotten lump of farm machinery. He grabbed a wrench and shouted, "Metal's metal! Rip it apart!" Men worked like mad, tearing panels, pulling out the radiator and fan housing. Denton's welding torch roared to life. Sparks flew, cutting through smoke and panic. He fused tractor parts to naval steel, rebuilding a cooling pump that was never meant to exist. Above them, another explosion shook the deck. Fire roared down the hatch, licking at his boots. Someone yelled for him to stop. He didn't. "Keep her breathing," he said. Eyes locked on the molten seam. The improvised repair shuddered, then held. Steam began to circulate again. The pressure gauge dipped, just barely, but enough. The Laffey's engine sputtered once, then turned over. Up on deck, sailors cheered as the ship's propellers groaned back to life. The destroyer wasn't dead yet. And in that smoke-filled chamber, with a tractor's heart beating inside a warship, Harold Denton grinned through his mask and whispered, "Told you. She's got fight left in her." The ship that shouldn't have survived had just refused to die. Every sailor was taught one rule about survival. If a ship is badly hit, you patch it, pray for calm seas, and wait for a repair dock. The open ocean wasn't a workshop, it was a graveyard. Naval doctrine called it containment. Keep the water out. Keep the pressure down. Keep the ship alive long enough for someone else to fix it. But that belief came from the safety of headquarters, not the heat of a boiler room. In April 1945, no one on the USS Laffey had time to wait for procedure. The Battle of Okinawa was a storm without horizon. Hundreds of Japanese planes diving at radar picket ships every day. The Navy called those destroyers floating targets. The Laffey was one of them. stationed just north of the invasion beachhead. Her job was to detect air raids and die buying time for others. The men knew it. They even had a saying, "If you're on picket duty, you're already halfway sunk." When the kamikazes came that morning, they didn't arrive in waves. They came in swarms. The ship's guns blazed until their barrels glowed red. Explosions ripped through the deck. Fuel lines burst. Bulkheads melted. The destroyer was no longer a vessel. It was a wounded animal. According to every manual, her fate was sealed. A warship that takes that much structural damage can't repair itself at sea. Cooling systems need dry dock precision. Steam lines require machine calibration, not field improvisation. But rules like that only make sense on paper. Harold Denton had learned his craft in a world without manuals. On a farm in Iowa, you didn't wait for spare parts where you made them. He'd fixed tractors with scrap plow metal and patched engines with shoe nails. The Navy saw a welder. The Laffey saw a mechanic who refused to quit. When everything around him collapsed, he didn't think about regulations. He thought about flow, pressure, and steel, the same logic that kept his father's combine running in a dust storm. "Dry docks are for peacetime," he said once. "War is when you make the dock wherever you're standing." That was his heresy. That was his miracle. Because before Okinawa ended, that crazy welder would prove that the best repair yard in the Pacific wasn't anchored to land. It was a man with a torch, working in the dark. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become an empire of steel. Ships upon ships, thousands of hulls crawling across half the planet. Keeping them alive was as important as firing their guns. Every torpedo, every bomb, every kamikaze strike tore holes that factories back home couldn't reach in time. So the U.S. Navy built something new: floating factories. Repair ships, tenders, and service barges followed the fleet like guardian angels of metal. They carried welders, machinists, electricians, and miles of steel plate. Some were outfitted with forges and lathes, others with portable foundries. They could rebuild an engine room 2,000 miles from the nearest dock. The USS Laffey belonged to that world. A radar picket destroyer, lean, fast, always first in line for punishment. Its job wasn't glory. It was to stand between the fleet and the sky. When enemy planes appeared on radar, Laffey called in the alert and drew the attack. In the Pacific, that meant being the first to burn. Down in the guts of the ship, men like Harold Denton made sure that when fire came, the ship could fight back. He wasn't a strategist or a commissioned officer. He was a chief petty officer, a man with a welding mask, a tool chest, and a stubborn streak. Before the war, Denton had been a farm boy from Iowa. Welding came naturally, not from textbooks, but from necessity. When a combine broke in the middle of harvest, you didn't order parts, you fixed what you had. He could fuse two mismatched pipes and make them hold under pressure. He could turn scrap into machinery. The Navy noticed. By 1943, he was teaching other sailors how to weld in storm conditions. But even he had never seen what the Pacific demanded: field surgery on ships gutted mid-battle. The Navy's damage control manuals were full of procedures: patch here, brace there, seal, and wait. None of them explained what to do when the whole ship was bleeding. That's what Okinawa turned into: a test not of firepower, but of repair. Destroyers were coming back with decks peeled open, boilers cracked, and propeller shafts twisted. And the orders were always the same: keep them fighting. No time for dockyards. Denton's team became the beating heart of that improvisation. They called themselves the floating welders, the men who made the impossible float a little longer. On April 16th, when Laffey was struck again and again, Denton's skill wasn't just useful. It was the difference between sinking and surviving. Because in the Pacific, steel didn't wait for rescue. It waited for someone mad enough to make it live again. War is made of numbers that never add up to reason. On April 16, 1945, those numbers ruled the deck of the USS Laffey. She was built to take 2 bomb hits before breaking apart. That morning, she took 4 bombs and 6 kamikaze strikes. Each plane hit with the weight of 3 tons, moving at over 400 miles per hour. The human bodies inside became part of the impact. The explosions tore through the aft deck, shredding gun mounts and ripping open fuel tanks. Fires erupted in every compartment. Below deck, water flooded the engine room. The heat rose past 500 degrees, 260 degrees. Paint blistered off the bulkheads. The air shimmered like molten glass. The ship's own fuel threatened to ignite. Ammunition cooked off in the ready racks. Communication lines were severed. The bridge had no contact with engineering. 70 men were dead or wounded. The medical bay was gone. Lifeboats were melted to the deck. Even if they abandoned ship, there was nowhere to go. The sea around them burned with oil. The engineers watched the pressure gauges climbing past red line. The boiler temperature was critical, the feed water system broken. If the cooling loop failed entirely, the boilers would explode with a force capable of tearing the hull in half. In the control rooms, someone whispered, "She can't take another hit." But another hit came anyway. A kamikaze smashed into the stern, detonating a bomb that split open the aft bulkhead. Flames poured down into the engine room, licking the steel plates that held back the boilers. The safety valves began to scream, a high, endless wail. Denton crawled through smoke and debris toward the sound. He found the main coolant pipe split open, spewing scalding steam. There was no replacement, no coupling, no spare. The nearest repair ship was hundreds of miles away. In that moment, he did math the Navy never taught. Boiler pressure versus rupture time, temperature versus steel fatigue. One failure, and everyone dies. He turned to his men and said, "We need circulation now. Anything that moves water." A machinist pointed toward the crushed cargo tractor in the storage bay. A diesel hauler used for unloading supplies. Its radiator and fan still intact. Denton grinned. "That'll do." The manuals didn't mention tractors, but numbers don't care where the metal comes from. Within minutes, the craziest repair in naval history had begun. The engine room looked like the inside of a furnace. Smoke rolled across the ceiling, and the red glow from the deck above flickered like lightning in reverse. Men coughed through rags tied around their mouths, eyes burning from the heat. Somewhere above them, gun crews were still firing, trying to keep the next kamikaze away. In that chaos, Harold Denton's voice cut through everything. "Get that tractor apart!" 2 sailors climbed over twisted pipes and burning cables toward the wrecked machine in the cargo bay. It had been used to move supplies on deck, a squat, ugly diesel tractor with a cracked frame and 1 intact radiator. Denton didn't care what it looked like. He only cared that it had flow. They pried off the radiator and fan housing, ripped out belts and tubing, dragging the parts down the ladder into the engine room. The ship shuddered as another explosion slammed the deck. The lights flickered. Denton didn't even look up. He knelt beside the shattered coolant line, sparks bouncing off his faceplate as he cut the broken section away. The air reeked of hot oil and blood. Steam hissed against his welding mask, forming beads of water that boiled off instantly. "Hand me the flange," he yelled. The machinist passed him the tractor's crank housing, still slick with grease. Denton lined it up against the ship's broken pipe. It didn't fit, not even close. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "We'll make it fit." He lit his torch again. The blue flame hissed to life, barely audible over the roar of burning fuel. He started to fuse tractor steel to naval alloy, metals that were never meant to meet. Sparks poured like rain. The hull groaned with every blast outside. "Sir, we've got steam backflow," someone shouted. "I know," Denton barked. "Keep that hand pump going." 2 men worked the manual pump in rhythm, drawing seawater up through hoses to keep the boiler from cooking itself alive. The floor plates burned their hands through their gloves, but the patch was taking shape. Denton hammered a final bolt, sealed the weld, and twisted the new connection into place. The fan belt from the tractor wound around an auxiliary pulley, his makeshift coolant loop. "All right," he said, panting. "Turn her over." The engines coughed once, twice, then roared. Steam pressure dropped by half. Coolant began to circulate again. The hull's vibration changed pitch, a pulse, returning to a dying body. On the bridge, power flickered back. Radar screens blinked to life. The captain leaned over the intercom. "Engineering, what the hell did you do down there?" Denton's voice came back, steady and hoarse. "Just welded a tractor into your warship, sir." A pause. Then laughter broke through the static. Sharp, disbelieving, alive. Moments later, another plane came in, low, trailing smoke. The ship's guns, back online, opened fire and tore it apart before it reached them. Below deck, Denton sank to his knees, exhausted. His patch held. The Laffey was breathing again, with a farmer's machine for a heart. He took off his mask and looked at the glowing weld seam. "You're not dying today," he whispered. The destroyer, somehow, listened. When the improvised coolant system came online, the ship stopped screaming. The shrill whistle of the safety valves faded, replaced by the deep rhythmic pulse of engines breathing again. The numbers on the gauges steadied. Pressure down to 420 psi, temperature stable. The Laffey was no longer a furnace waiting to explode. It was a crippled warship that could still fight. Up above, the captain didn't yet know why. He only knew his guns had power again. Ammunition hoists started working, turrets came alive. Within minutes, the crew on deck resumed firing. Shells screamed into the sky, shredding the next formation of kamikazes before they could dive. The destroyer was fighting back with a heart half machine, half miracle. The chain reaction spread across the ship. Denton's welds kept the boiler alive, which powered the generators which fed the guns. The guns protected the hull long enough for the crew to control the fires. The fires stopped eating through the bulkheads. The ship's fate reversed, not because of command orders or reinforcements, but because one man refused to let steel surrender. By the time help arrived, 2 tugs and a repair vessel, the Laffey was still afloat. Smoke poured from her decks. Her stern was nearly gone, but her flag was still flying. She had been hit by 22 enemy aircraft, 4 bombs, and 6 kamikazes. And somehow, she was still shooting. Later analysis from naval engineers estimated the odds of survival at less than 2%. Without active cooling, the boilers would have detonated within 10 minutes. The explosion radius would have vaporized half the crew. Instead, the crazy welder from Iowa had altered the equation. His jury-rigged system, built from a tractor fan, a radiator, and scavenged pipe, held for 3 full days until the Laffey reached Okinawa Harbor. To anyone else, it looked like luck. To Denton, it was just good math. Pressure, flow, heat, and stubbornness. He had rewritten the logic of the battlefield. When a system collapses, sometimes the smallest fix ripples outward until it saves an entire warship. And somewhere in the chaos of smoke and sparks, a quiet truth settled over the crew. Genius wasn't always found in blueprints. Sometimes it crawled out of the engine room holding a torch. When the battle finally ended, the USS Laffey looked more like a floating scrapyard than a warship. Her stern was split open, the aft gun mounts were piles of twisted metal, and the deck still smoked from molten pools of aluminum. The ship's silhouette, once sharp and proud, now sagged at the center like a wounded beast that refused to lie down. Below deck, Harold Denton and his crew worked for 18 straight hours after the last plane fell. They patched steam lines, reinforced bulkheads with spare armor plates, and kept seawater flowing through the tractor radiator that had become the ship's most important organ. The fan belt hummed unevenly, but it held. Every turn of that salvaged part meant another minute of life. The next morning, an engineering officer from another destroyer came aboard to inspect the damage. He stopped short when he saw the tractor assembly bolted into the coolant system. "What in God's name is that?" he asked. Denton didn't look up from his welding. "That, sir, is a miracle on 4 bolts." The officer stared for a long moment, then said, "You welded a farm tractor into a Navy destroyer." Denton shrugged. "Ain't that what America does?" Word spread across the fleet. Crews from nearby ships came to see the Laffey, the destroyer that refused to die, running on a machine meant for hauling dirt. Some laughed. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. Engineers recorded everything, taking photographs of the modification. One caption later entered the official maintenance manual as a footnote. Unorthodox cooling solution observed aboard USS Laffey. Effective under combat conditions. By then, the men were too exhausted to care about history. They had survived the longest sustained kamikaze assault on any U.S. ship during the war. Out of a crew of 336, more than 70 were dead or wounded. But the vessel was still operational, a ghost of steel and willpower. When Naval Command sent a message asking how she was still afloat, the captain radioed back, "She's got a farmer's engine in her belly, and a welder who doesn't know what impossible means." The answer became legend before the ship even reached harbor. For the next 3 days, the Laffey limped toward Okinawa under her own power. The deckhands slept where they fell. Denton's crew kept the tractor fan spinning, greasing the bearings with rationed oil, tightening bolts when they came loose from vibration. Each sunrise felt borrowed. Each hour the ship stayed afloat felt like another defiance of math. When the island finally appeared on the horizon, Denton looked through the smoke at the outline of land and muttered, "Told you she'd make it home." No one argued. The ship had become proof that ingenuity could be armor, and madness could be method. Okinawa Harbor, April 19th, 1945. The sea was calm, but the USS Laffey arrived looking like she had sailed through hell and come back only halfway. Her hull was charred, her radar mast bent like a broken arm, and her aft section sagged open, revealing a wound that could swallow a truck. As tugboats guided her in, crews on nearby ships stopped what they were doing. They stared in silence at the destroyer that had taken more punishment than any vessel her size should have survived. Her guns were still pointing upward, scorched black but intact, as if daring the sky to try again. When the Laffey finally docked, naval engineers swarmed aboard. They expected to find a dead ship barely held together by luck. What they found instead was a masterpiece of desperation. In the engine room, they froze at the sight. A crude but perfectly functional cooling system built from the radiator, crankcase, and fan housing of a Caterpillar tractor welded directly into the ship's steam loop. Piping scavenged from handrails, wiring from floodlights, even a piece of the galley stove door used as a seal plate. The senior engineer muttered, "This shouldn't have worked." Denton, still in his soot-stained overalls, smiled without looking up. "That's what everyone keeps saying." The inspection team spent hours tracing his welds, mapping every modification. They measured temperatures, flow rates, and pressure consistency. The readings were nearly stable. In some spots, the patch worked better than the original design. One officer leaned against a bulkhead and said quietly, "You didn't just save the ship, Chief. You rewrote our repair manual." Word reached Admiral Spruance's staff within a day. A coded message circulated through the fleet. Destroyer DD-724 sustained 22 air hits, remained afloat under improvised engineering measures. Cause: extraordinary field adaptation. Back home, the story didn't make headlines. The world was already turning toward victory parades and atomic secrets. But within the Navy, the legend of the tractor ship spread from dockyard to dockyard. Training schools added new lessons on field welding and adaptive repair, all inspired by one man's insanity that happened to work. When the official investigation concluded, the board's recommendation was brief. Commendation recommended for Chief Petty Officer Harold Denton, ingenuity and courage under fire. But when the medal ceremony came months later, Denton didn't attend. He had already been reassigned to another ship, fixing engines again somewhere near Guam. Reporters later asked him about Okinawa. He just said, "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying not to explode." For the men who survived, he was more than a welder. He was the reason their ship had come home, and for the Navy, he was proof that genius isn't born in academies. Sometimes it crawls out of the engine room with a torch and an impossible idea. When the reports were filed and the medals handed out, the USS Laffey was already more legend than ship. Her scars became lessons, her survival became statistics, and the man who refused to quit went back to welding as if nothing had happened. But inside the Navy's engineering circles, one truth settled in. Harold Denton had changed the math of survival. Before Okinawa, warships were built to perfection. After Okinawa, they were built to endure. The manuals began to say it openly. Improvisation under combat conditions is not failure, it is command. Denton's tractor fix became a case study in adaptability. Not because it was elegant, but because it worked. His logic was brutally simple. All machinery speaks the same language: pressure, heat, and motion. It doesn't care whether its parts come from a factory or a farm. That philosophy reshaped the Navy's doctrine of field repair. Training now emphasized initiative over obedience. Blueprints build ships, one instructor said, but it's judgment that keeps them alive. The Laffey would later earn the nickname, the ship that would not die. Her decks were rebuilt, her engines refitted, but the welded seams from that day were never removed. They stayed there, silent reminders of the moment when logic broke and madness saved 300 men. Harold Denton never sought recognition. When journalists found him years later working at a steel yard in Kansas, they asked if he'd ever been scared during the attack. He smiled and said, "Sure, but fear's just another kind of fuel. It burns if you use it right." That sentence summed up the entire war in one man's voice. Because for every engineer who designed a perfect ship, there was a welder somewhere in the dark, fixing the cracks they never planned for. The Pacific didn't reward caution. It rewarded invention. And on that day in April 1945, one crazy welder proved that sometimes the strongest armor isn't steel at all. It's the refusal to believe that something can't be done. The Pacific kept its secrets, but the name Laffey never disappeared. She became the ship school children would visit decades later. The destroyer that survived 22 planes. The steel ghost that refused to die. Beneath her decks, the old weld seams still glimmer faintly under the paint, holding together history itself. Harold Denton went home to Iowa after the war. He never called himself a hero. When asked what he thought about being remembered as the crazy welder, he laughed. Crazy's just what they call you before it works. He was right. His madness was method. His welding torch was courage made visible. The war was built on engineers and admirals, but it was won by men who looked at impossible problems and said, "Give me metal."